A Critical History of Greek Philosophy, Chapter 16, Parmenides. Parmenides was born about 514 BC at Elea. Not much is known of his life. He was in his early youth a Pythagorean, but recanted that philosophy and formulated a philosophy of his own. He was greatly revered in antiquity both for the depth of his intellect and the sublimity and nobility of his character. Plato refers to him always with reverence. His philosophy is comprised in a philosophic didactic poem which is divided into two parts. The first part expounds his own philosophy and is called The Way of Truth. The second part describes the false opinions current in his day and is called The Way of Opinion. The reflection of Parmenides takes its rise from observation of the transitoriness and changeableness of things. The world, as we know it, is a world of change and mutation. All things arise and pass away. Nothing is permanent. Nothing stands. One moment it is, another moment it is not. It is as true to say of anything that it is not as that it is. The truth of things cannot lie here, for no knowledge of that which is constantly changing is possible. Hence, the thought of Parmenides becomes the effort to find the eternal amid the shifting, the abiding and everlasting amid the change and mutation of things. And this arises in this way the antithesis between being and not being. The absolutely real is being, not being is the unreal. Not being is not at all, and this not being he identifies with becoming with the world of shifting and changing things. The world which is known to us by the senses, the world of senses, is unreal, illusory, a mere appearance. It is not being, only being truly is. As Thales designated water the one reality, as the Pythagoreans named number, so now for Parmenides the sole reality, the first principle of things, is being, wholly unmixed with not being, wholly excludent of all becoming. The character of being he describes for the most part in a series of negatives. There is in it no change. It is absolutely unbecome and imperishable. It has neither beginning nor end, neither arising nor passing away. If being begin, it must have arisen either from being or from not being. But for being to arise out of being, that is not a beginning. And for being to arise out of not being is impossible, since there is then no reason why it should arise later rather than sooner. Being cannot come out of not being, nor something out of nothing. Ex nihilo nihil fit. This is the fundamental thought of Parmenides. Moreover, we cannot say of being that it was, that it is, that it will be. There is for it no past, no present, and no future. It is rather externally and timelessly present. It is undivided and indivisible. For anything to be divided, it must be divided by something other than itself. But there is nothing other than being. There is no not being. Therefore, there is nothing by which being can be divided. Hence, it is indivisible. It is unmoved and undistributed, undisturbed. For motion and disturbance are forms of becoming, and all becoming is excluded from being. It is absolutely self identical. It does not arise from anything other than itself. It does not pass into anything other than itself. It has its whole being in itself. It does not depend upon anything else for its being and reality. It does not pass over into otherness. It remains steadfast and abiding in itself. Of positive character, being has nothing. Its sole character is simply its being. It cannot be said that it is this or that. It cannot be said that it has this or that quality, that it is here and there, then or now. It is simply is. Its only quality is, so to speak, isness. But in permanence, there emerges for the first time a distinction of fundamental importance in philosophy. The distinction between sense and reason, the world of falsity and appearance, of becoming, of not being. This is, says Parmenides, the world which is presented to us by the senses. True and veritable being is known to us only by reason, by thought. The senses, therefore, are for Parmenides the sources of all illusion and error. Truth lies only in reason. This is exceedingly important because that truth lies in reason and not in the world of sense is the fundamental position of idealism. The doctrine of being just described occupies the first part of the poem of Parmenides. The second part is the way of false opinion. But whether Parmenides is here simply giving an account of the false philosophies of his day, and in doing this there does not seem much point, or whether he was, with total inconsistency, attempting in a cosmological theory of his own to explain the origin of that world of appearance and illusion, whose very being he has in the first part of the poem denied. This does not seem to be clear. The theory here propounded, at any rate, is that the sense world is composed of the two opposites, the hot and the cold, or light and darkness. The more hot there is, the more life, the more reality, the more cold, the more unreality and death. What position now are we to assign to Parmenides in philosophy? How are we to characterize his system? Such writers as Hegel, Ardemon, and Schwielger have always interpreted his philosophy in an idealistic sense. Professor Burnet, however, takes the opposite view. To quote his own words, Parmenides is not, as some have said, the father of idealism. On the contrary, all materialism depends upon his view. Footnote 5. Now, if we cannot say whether Parmenides was a materialist or an idealist, we cannot be said to understand much of his philosophy. This question is therefore of cardinal importance. Let us see in the first place upon what grounds the materialistic interpretation of Parmenides is based. It is based upon a fact which I have so far not mentioned, leaving it for explanation at this moment. Parmenides said that being, which is for him the ultimate reality, occupies space, is finite, and is spherical or globe-shaped. Now that which occupies space and has shape is matter. The ultimate reality of things, therefore, is conceived by Parmenides as material, and this, of course, is the cardinal thesis of materialism. This interpretation of Parmenides is further emphasized in the disagreement between himself and Melissus as to whether being is finite or infinite. Melissus was a younger adherent of the Eleatic school, whose chief interest lies in his views on this question. His philosophical position in general is the same as that of Parmenides, but on this point they differed. Parmenides asserted that being is globe-shaped and therefore finite. Now it was an essential part of the doctrine of Parmenides that empty space is non-existent. Empty space is an existent non-existence. This is self-contradictory, and for Parmenides, therefore, empty space is simply not being. There are, for example, no interstices or empty spaces between the particles of matter. Being is the full, that is, full space with no mixture of empty space in it. Now, Melissus agreed with Parmenides that there is no such thing as empty space, and he pointed out that if being is globe shaped, it must be bounded on the outside by empty space. And as this is impossible, it cannot be true that being is globe-shaped or finite, but must, on the contrary, extend illimitably through space. This makes it quite clear that Parmenides, Melissus, and the Eleatics generally did regard being as, in some sense, material. Footnote 5, Early Greek Philosophy, Chapter IV 8-9. Now, however, let us turn to the other side of the picture. What ground is there for regarding Parmenides as an idealist? In the first place, we may say that his ultimate principle, being, whatever he may have thought of it, is not in fact material but is essentially an abstract thought, a concept. Being is not here, it is not there. It is not in any place or time. It is not to be found by the senses. It is to be found only in reason. We form the idea of being by the process of abstraction. For example, we see the desk. Our entire knowledge of the desk consists of our knowledge of its qualities. It is square, brown, hard, odorless, etc. Now suppose we successively strip off these qualities in thought, its color, its size, its shape. We shall ultimately be left with nothing at all except its mere being. We can no longer say of it that it is hard, square, etc. We can only say it is. As Parmenides said, being is not divisible, movable. It is not here, not there, then or now. It is simply is. This is the Eleatic notion of being, and it is pure concept. It may be compared to such an idea as whiteness. We cannot see whiteness. We see white things, but not whiteness itself. What then is whiteness? It is a concept, that is to say, not a particular thing, but a general idea, which we form by abstraction, by considering the quality which all white things have in common, and neglecting the qualities in which they differ. Just go, if we consider the common character of all objects in the universe and neglect their differences, we shall find that what they all have in common is simply being. Being then is a general idea or concept. It is a thought and not a thing. Parmenides therefore actually placed the absolute reality of things in an idea, in a thought, though he may have conceived it in a material and sensuous way. Now the cardinal thesis of idealism is precisely this, that the absolute reality of which the world is a manifestation consists of thoughts in concepts. Parmenides, on this view, was an idealist. Moreover, Parmenides has clearly made the distinction between sense and reason. True being is not known to the senses, but only to reason, and this distinction is an essential feature of all idealism. Materialism is precisely the view that reality is to be found in the world of sense. But the proposition of Parmenides is the exact opposite of this, namely that reality is to be found only in reason. Again, there begins to appear for the first time in Parmenides the distinction between reality and appearance. Parmenides, of course, would not have used these terms, which have been adopted in modern times, but the thought which they express is unmistakably there. This outward world, the world of sense, he proclaims to be illusion and appearance. Reality is something which lies behind and is invisible to the senses. Now, the very essence of materialism is that this material world, this world of sense, is the real world. Idealism is the doctrine that is sense world is an appearance. How then can Parmenides be called a materialist? How are we reconcile these two conflicting views of Parmenides? I think the truth is that these two contradictories lie side by side in Parmenides, unreconciled and still mutually contradicting each other. Parmenides himself did not see the contradiction. If we emphasize the one side, then Parmenides was a materialist. If we emphasize the other side, then he is to be interpreted as an idealist. In point of fact, in the history of Greek philosophy, both these sides of Parmenides were successively emphasized. He became the father both of materialism and of idealism. His immediate successors, Empedocles and Democritus, seized upon the materialistic aspect of his thought and developed it. The essential thought of Parmenides was that being cannot arise from not being, and that being neither arises nor passes away. If we apply this idea to matter, we get what in modern times is called the doctrine of the indestructibility of matter. Matter has no beginning and no end. The apparent arising and passing away of things is simply the aggregation and separation of particles of matter which in themselves are indestructible. This is precisely the position of Democritus, and his doctrine, therefore, is a materialistic rendering of the main thought of Parmenides that being cannot arise from not being or pass into not being. It was not till the time of Plato that the idealistic aspect of the Parmenidean doctrine was developed. It was the genius of Plato which seized upon the germs of idealism in Parmenides and developed them. Plato was deeply influenced by Parmenides. His main doctrine was the reality of the world is to be found in thought, in concepts, in what is called the idea. And he identified the idea with the being of Parmenides. But still, it may be asked, which is historical Parmenides? Was not Plato, in interpreting him, idealistically reading his own thought into Parmenides? Are not we, if we interpret him as an idealist, reading into him later ideas? In one sense, this is perfectly true. It is clear from what Parmenides himself said that he regarded the ultimate reality of things as material. It would be a complete mistake to attribute to him a fully developed and consistent system of idealism. If you had told Parmenides that he was an idealist, he would not have understood you. The distinction between materialism and idealism was not then developed. If you had told him, moreover, that being is a concept, he would not have understood you, because the theory of concepts was not developed until the time of Socrates and Plato. Now it is the function of historical criticism to insist upon this, to see that later thought is not attributed to Parmenides. But if this is the function of historical scholarship, it is equally the function of philosophic insight to seize upon the germs of a higher thought amid the confused thinking of Parmenides, to see what he was groping for, to see clearly what he saw only vaguely and dimly, to make explicit what in him was merely implicit, to exhibit the true inwardness of his teaching, to separate what is valuable and essential in it from what is worthless and accidental. And I say that in this sense, the true and essential meaning of Parmenides is his idealism. I said in the first chapter that philosophy is the movement from sensuous to non-sensuous thought. I said that it is only with the utmost difficulty that this movement occurs. And I say that even the greatest philosophers have sometimes failed herein. In Parmenides, we have the first example of this. He began by propounding the truth that being is the essential reality, and being, as we saw, is a concept. But Parmenides was a pioneer. He trod upon unbroken ground. He had not behind him, as we have, a long line of idealistic thinkers to guide him. So he could not maintain the first nonsensuous thought. He could not resist the temptation to frame for himself a mental image, a picture of being. Now, all mental images and pictures are framed out of material supplied to us by the senses. Hence, it comes about the Parmenides pictured being as a globe-shaped something occupying space. But this is not the truth of Parmenides. This is simply his failure to realize and understand his own principle and to think his own thought. It is true that his immediate successors, Empedocles and Democritus, seized upon this and built their philosophies upon it. But in doing so, they were building upon the darkness of Parmenides, upon his darkness of vision, upon his inability to grapple with his own idea. It was Plato who built upon the light of Parmenides. Chapter 17. Zeno. The third and last important thinker of the Eleatic school is Zeno, who, like Parmenides, was a man of Elea. His birth is placed about 489 BC. He composed a prose treatise in which he developed his philosophy. Zeno's contribution to Eleatism is, in a sense, entirely negative. He did not add anything positive to the teachings of Parmenides. He supports Parmenides in the doctrine of being, but it is not the conclusions of Zeno that are novel. It is rather the reasons which he gave for them. In attempting to support the Parmenidean doctrine from a new point of view, he developed certain ideas about the ultimate character of space and time, which have since been of the utmost importance in philosophy. Parmenides had taught that the world of sense is illusory and false. The essentials of that world are two: multiplicity and change. True being is absolutely one. There is in it no plurality, multiplicity. Being, moreover, is absolutely static and unchangeable. There is in it no motion. Multiplicity and motion are the two characteristics of the false world of sense. against multiplicity and motion. Therefore, Zeno directed his arguments and attempts indirectly to support the conclusion of permanence by showing that multiplicity and motion are impossible. He attempted to force multiplicity and motion to refute themselves by showing that if we assume them as real, contradictory propositions follow from the assumption. Two propositions which contradict each other cannot both be true. Therefore, the assumption from which both follow, namely multiplicity and motion, cannot be real things. Zeno's arguments against multiplicity. If the many is, it must be both infinitely small and infinitely large. The many must be infinitely small, for it is composed of units. This is what we mean by saying that it is many. It is many parts or units. These units must be indivisible, for if they are further divisible, then they are not units. Since they are indivisible, they can have no magnitude, for that which has magnitude is divisible. The many, therefore, is composed of units which have no magnitude, but if none of the parts of the many have magnitude, the many as a whole has none. Therefore, the many is infinitely small. But the many must also be infinitely large, for the many has magnitude, and as such is divisible into parts. These parts still have magnitude and are therefore further divisible. However far we proceed with the division, the parts still have magnitude and are still divisible. Hence, the many is divisible and infinitum. It must therefore be composed of an infinite number of parts, each having magnitude. But the smallest magnitude multiplied by infinity becomes an infinite magnitude. Therefore, the many is infinitely large. The many must be in number, both limited and unlimited. It must be limited because it is just as many as it is, no more, no less. It is therefore a definite number. But a definite number is a finite or limited number, but the many must be also unlimited in number, for it is infinitely divisible or composed of infinite number of parts. Zeno's arguments against motion. 1. In order to travel a distance, a body must first travel half the distance. There remains half left for it still to travel. It must then travel half the remaining distance. There is still a remainder. This progress proceeds infinitely, but there is always a remainder untraveled. Therefore, it is impossible for a body to travel from one point to another. It can never arrive. Achilles the tortoise ran a race. 2. If the tortoise is given a start, Achilles can never catch it up. For in the first place, he must run to the point from which the tortoise started. When he gets there, the tortoise will have gone to a point further on. Achilles must then run to the point and finds then that the tortoise has reached a third point. This will go forever, the distance between them continuously diminishing but never being wholly wiped out. Achilles will never catch up the tortoise. 3. This is the story of flying arrow. An object cannot be in two places at the same time. Therefore, at any particular movement in its flight, the arrow is in one place and not in two. But to be one place is to be at rest. Therefore, in each and every moment of its flight, it is at rest. It is thus the rest throughout. Motion is impossible. This type of argument is in modern time called antinomy. An antinomy is a proof that since two contradictory propositions equally follow from a given assumption, must be false. Zeno is also called by Aristotle the inventor of dialectic. Dialectic originally meant simply discussion, but it has come to be a technical term in philosophy and is used for that type of reasoning which seeks to develop the truth by making the false refute and contradict itself. The conception of dialectic is especially important in Zeno, Plato, Kant, and Hegel. All the arguments which Zeno uses against multiplicity and motion are in reality merely variations of one argument. That argument is as follows: it applies equally to space, to time, or to anything which can be quantitatively measured. For simplicity, we will consider it only in its spatial significance. Any quantity of space, say the space enclosed within a circle, must either be composed of ultimate indivisible units or it must be divisible ad infinitum. If it is composed of indivisible units, these must have magnitude, and we are faced with the contradiction of a magnitude which cannot be divided. If it is divisible ad infinitum, we are faced with the contradiction of supporting that an infinite number of parts can be added up and make a finite sum total. It is thus a great mistake to suppose that Zeno's stories of Achilles and Tortoise and the flying arrow are merely childish puzzles. On the contrary, Zeno was the first, by means of these stories, to bring to light the essential contradictions which lie in our ideas of space and time, and thus to set an important problem for all subsequent philosophy. All Zeno's arguments are based upon the one argument described above, which may be called the antinomy of infinite divisibility. For example, the story of the flying arrow at any moment of its flight, says Zeno, it must be in one place because it cannot be in two places at the same moment. This depends upon the view of time as being infinitely divisible. It is only in an infinitesimal moment, an absolute moment having no duration, that the arrow is at rest. This, however, is not the only antinomy which we find in our conceptions of space and time. Every mathematician is acquainted with the contradictions immanent in our ideas of infinity. For example, the familiar proposition that parallel straight lines meet at infinity is a contradiction. Again, a decreasing geometrical progression can be added up to infinity, the infinite number of its terms adding up in the sum total to a finite number. The idea of infinite space itself is contradiction. You can say of it exactly what Zeno said of the many. There must be in existence as much space as there is no more. But this means that there must be a definite and limited amount of space. Therefore, space is infinite. On the other hand, it is impossible to conceive a limit to space. Beyond the limit, there must be more space. Therefore, space is infinite. Zeno himself gave expression to this antinomy in the form of an argument which I have not so far mentioned. He said that everything which exists in a space, space itself exists. Therefore, space must be in space. That space must be in another space, and so ad infinitum. This, of course, is merely a quaint way of saying that to conceive a limit to space is impossible. But to return to the antinomy of infinite divisibility, on which most of Zeno's arguments stressed, you will perhaps expect me to say something of the different solutions which have been offered. In the first place, we must forget Zeno's own solution. He did not propound this contradiction for its own sake, but to support the thesis of Parmenides. His solution is that as multiplicity and motion contain these contradictions, therefore multiplicity and motion cannot be real. Therefore, there is, as Parmenides said, only one being with no multiplicity in it, and excludent of all motion and becoming. The solution given by Kant in modern times is essentially similar. According to Kant, these contradictions are immanent in our conceptions of space and time. And since time and space involves these contradictions, it follows that they are not real beings, but appearances, mere phenomena. Space and time do not belong to things as they are in themselves, but rather to our way of looking at things. They are forms of our perception. It is our minds which impose space and time upon objects, and not objects which impose space and time upon our minds. Further, Kant drew from these contradictions the conclusion that to comprehend the infinite is beyond the capacity of human reason. He attempted to show that wherever we try to think the infinite, whether the infinitely large or the infinitely small, we fall into irreconcilable contradictions. Therefore, he concluded that human faculties are incapable of apprehending infinity. As might be expected, many thinkers have attempted to solve the problem by denying one or other side of the contradiction, by saying that one or other side does not follow from the premises that one is true and the other is false. David Hume, for example, denied the infinite divisibility of space and time and declared that they are composed of indivisible units having magnitude. But the difficulty that it is impossible to conceive of units having magnitude which are yet indivisible is not satisfactorily explained by Hume. And in general, it seems that any solution which is to be satisfactory must somehow make room for both sides of the contradiction. It will not do to deny one side or the other, to say that one is false and the other is true. A true solution is only possible by rising above the level of the two antilogistic principles and taking them both up to the level of a higher conception, in which both opposites are reconciled. This was the procedure followed by Hegel in his solution of the problem. Unfortunately, his solution cannot be fully understood without some knowledge of his general philosophical principles, on which it wholly depends. I will, however, try to make it as plain as possible. In the first place, Hegel did not go out of his way to solve these antinomies. They appear as mere incidents in the development of his thought. He did not regard them as isolated cases of contradiction which occur in thought. as exceptions to a general rule, which therefore need special explanation. On the contrary, he regarded them not as exceptions to, but as examples of the essential character of reason. All thought, all reason, for Hegel, contains immanent contradictions, which it at first posits and then reconciles in a higher unity. And this particular contradiction of infinite divisibility is reconciled in the higher notion of quantity. The notion of quantity contains two factors, namely the one and the many. Quantity means precisely a many in one or a one in many. If, for example, we consider a quantity of anything, say heap of wheat, this is, in the first place, one, it is one whole. Secondly, it is many, for it is composed of many parts. As one, it is continuous; as many, it is discrete. Now, the true notion of quantity is not one apart from many, nor many apart from one. It is the synthesis of both. It is a many in one. The antinomy we are considering arises from considering one side of the truth and a false abstraction from the other. To conceive unity as not being in itself multiplicity, or multiplicity as not being unity, is a false abstraction. The thought of the one involves the thought of the many, and the thought of the many involves the thought of the one. You cannot have a many without a one, any more than you can have one end of the stick without the other. Now, if we consider anything which is quantitatively measured, such as a straight line, we may consider it in the first place as one. In that case, it is a continuous indivisible unit. Next, we may regard it as many, in which case it falls into parts. Now, each of these parts may again be regarded as one, and as such is an indivisible unit. And again, each part may be regarded as many, in which each case it falls into further parts, and this alternating process may go on forever. This is the view of the matter which gives rise to the contradiction we have been considering. But it is a false view. It involves the false abstraction of first regarding the many as something that has reality apart from the one, and then regarding the one as something that has reality apart from the many. If you persist in saying that the line is simply one and not many, then there arises the theory of indivisible units. If you persist in saying it is simply many and not one, then it is divisible ad infinitum. But the truth is that it is neither simply many nor simply one. It is many in one, that is, it is quantity. Both sides of the contradictions are therefore in one sense true, for each is a factor of the truth. But both sides are also false, if and is so far as each sets itself up as the whole truth. Critical remarks of Eliaticism. The consideration of the meaning of Zeno's doctrine will give us an insight into the essentials of the position of the Eleatics. Zeno said that motion and multiplicity are not real. Now, what does this mean? Did Zeno mean to say that when he walked about the streets of Elea, it was not true that he walked about? Did he mean that it was not a fact that he moved from place to place? When I move my arms, did he mean that I'm not moving my arms, but that they really remain at rest all the time? If so, we might justly conclude that this philosophy is a mere craze of speculation drawn mad or else a joke. But this is not what he meant. The Eleatic position is that though the world of sense, of which multiplicity and motion are essential features, may exist, yet that outward world is not the true being. They do not deny that the world exists. They do not deny the motion exists or the multiplicity exists. These things no sane man can deny. The existence of motion and multiplicity is, as Hegel says, as sensuously certain as the existence of elephants. Zeno then does not deny the existence of the world. What he denies is the truth of existence. What he means is certainly there is motion and multiplicity, certainly the world is here, is present to our senses, but it is not the true world. It is not reality, it is mere appearance, illusion, an outward show and sham, a hollow mask which hides the real being of things. You may ask what is meant by this distinction between appearance and reality. Is not even an appearance real? It appears, it exists. Even a delusion exists and is therefore a real thing. So is not the distinction between appearance and reality itself meaningless? Now, all these is differ perfectly true, but it does not comprehend quite what is meant by the distinction. What is meant is that the objects around us have existence, but not self-existence, not self-sustainability. This is to say, their being is not in themselves. Their existence is not grounded in themselves, but is grounded in another and flows from that other. They exist, but they are not independent existence. They are rather beings whose being flows into them from another, which itself is self existent and self substantial. They are therefore mere appearances of that other, which is the reality. Of course, the Eleatics did not speak of appearance and reality in these terms, but this is what they were groping for, and dimly saw. If we now look back upon the road on which we have travelled from the beginning of Greek philosophy, we shall be able to characterize the direction in which we have been moving. The earliest Greek philosophers, the Ionics, propounded the question, what is the ultimate principle of the things, and answered it by declaring that the first principle of things is matter. The second Greek school, the Pythagoreans, answered the same question by declaring numbers to be the first principle. The third school, the Eleatics, answered the questions by asserting that the first principle of things is being. Now, the universe as we know it is both quantitative and qualitative. Quantity and quality are characteristics of every sense object. These are not indeed the only characteristics of the world, but they are the only characteristics which have so far come to light. Now, the position of the Ionics was that the ultimate reality is both quantitative and qualitative. That is to say, it is matter, for matter is just what has both quantity and quality. The Pythagoreans abstracted from the quality of things. They stripped off the qualitative aspect from things and were accordingly left with only quantity as ultimate reality. Quantity is the same as number. Hence, the Pythagorean position that the world is made of numbers, the Eleatic philosophy proceeding one step further in the same direction, abstracted from quantity as well as quality. Whereas the Pythagoreans had denied the qualitative aspect of things, leaving themselves only with the quantitative, the Eleatics denied both quantity and quality, for in denying multiplicity, they denied quantity. Therefore, they are left with the total abstraction of mere being, which has in neither dividedness quantity nor positive character quality. The rise from the Ionic to the Eleatic philosophy is therefore essentially a rise from sensuous to pure thinking. The Eleatic being is a pure abstract thought. The position of the Pythagoreans, on the other hand, is that of semi sensuous thought. They form the stepping stone from the Ionics to the Eleatics. Now let us consider what of worth there is in this Eleatic principle and what its defects are. In the first place, it is necessary for us to understand that the Eleatic philosophy is the first monoism. A monoistic philosophy is a philosophy which attempts to explain the entire universe from one single principle. The opposite of monoism is therefore pluralism, which is what that kind of philosophy which seeks to explain the universe from many ultimate and equally underived principles. But more particularly and more frequently, we speak of the opposite of monoism as being dualism, that is to say, the position that there are two ultimate principles of explanation. If, for example, we say that all the good in the universe arises from one source which is good, and that all the evil arises from another source which is evil, and that these sources of good and evil cannot be subordinated one to the another, and that one does not arise out of the other, but both are coordinate and equally primeval and independent. That position would be a dualism. All philosophy which is worthy of name seeks, in some sense, a monistic explanation of the universe, and when we find that a system of philosophy breaks down and fails, then we may nearly always be sure its defects will reveal itself as unreconciled dualism. Such a philosophy will begin with a monoistic principle and will attempt to derive or deduce the entire universe from it. But somewhere or other it comes across something in the world which it cannot bring under that principle, then it is left with two equally ultimate existence, neither of which can be derived from the other. Thus it breaks out into dualism. Now the search for a monoistic explanation of things is a universal tendency of human thought. Wherever we look in the world of thought, we find that the monoistic tendency appears. I have already said that it appears throughout the history of philosophy. It reveals itself too very clearly in the history of religion. Religion begins in polytheism, the belief in many gods. From that, it passes on to monotheism, the belief in one God, who is the sole author and creator of the universe. In Hindu thought, we find the same thing. Hindu thought is based upon the principle that all is one, everything is the world, is derived from one ultimate being, Brahman. But not only is this monistic tendency traceable in religion and philosophy, it is also traceable in science. The progress of scientific explanation is essentially a progress towards monism. In the first place, the explanation of isolated facts consists always in assigning causes for them. Suppose there is a strange noise in your room at night. You say it is explained when you find that it is due to the falling of a book or the scuttling of a rat across the floor. The noise is thus explained by assigning a cause for it. But this simply means that you have robbed it of its isolated and exceptional position and reduced it to the position of an example of a general law. When the water freezes in your jug, you say that the cause of this is the cold. It is an example of the law that whenever the cold reaches a certain degree, then the other things being equal, water solidifies. But to assign causes in this way is not really to explain anything. It does not give any reason for an event happening. You cannot see any reason why water should solidify in the cold. It merely tells us that the event is not exceptional, but is an example of what always happens. It reduces the isolated event to a case of a general law which explains not merely this one event but possibly millions of events. It is not merely that cold solidifies the water in your jug, it equally solidifies the water in everybody's jug. The same law explains all these and likewise explains icebergs and the polar caps on the Earth and the planet Mars. In fact, scientific explanation means the reduction of millions of facts to one principle. But science does not stop here. It seeks further to explain the laws themselves, and its method is to reduce the many laws to one higher and more general law. A familiar example of this is explanation of Kepler's law of the planetary motions. Kepler laid down three such laws. The first was that planets move in elliptical orbits with the sun in one focus. The second was the planet describe equal areas in equal times. The third was a rather more complicated law. Kepler knew these laws from observation, but he could not explain them. They were explained by Newton's discovery of the law of gravitation. Newton proved that Kepler's three laws could be mathematically deduced from the law of gravitation. In that way, Kepler's laws were explained. And not only Kepler's laws, but many other astronomical laws and facts. Thus, the explanation of the many isolated facts consists in their reduction to the one law, and the explanation of the many laws consists in their reduction to the one more general law. As knowledge advances, the phenomena of the universe come to be explained by fewer and wider general principles. Obviously, the ultimate goal would be explanation of all things by one principle. I do not mean to say that scientific men have this end consciously in view, but the point is that the monistic tendency is there. What is meant by the explanation is the reduction of all things to one principle. In philosophy, in religion, and in science, then we find this monistic tendency of thought. But it might be asked how we know that this is universal tendency is right? How do we know that it is not merely a universal error? Is there no logical or philosophical basis for the belief that the ultimate explanation of things must be one? Now, this is a subject which takes us far afield from Greek philosophy. The philosophical basis of monism was never thought out till the time of Spinoza. So, we cannot go into it at length here, but quite shortly, the question is there any reason for believing that the ultimate explanation of things must be one? Now, if we are to explain the universe, two conditions must be fulfilled. In the first place, the ultimate reality by which we attempt to explain everything must explain all the other things in the world. It must be possible to deduce the whole world from it. Secondly, the first principle must explain itself. It cannot be a principle which itself still requires explanation by something else. If it is itself not self explanatory but is an intimate mystery, then even if we succeed in deducing the universe from it, nothing is thereby explained. This, for example, is precisely the defect of materialism. Even if we suppose it proved that all things, including mind, arise from matter, yet objection remains that this explains nothing at all, for matter is not a self explanatory existence. It is an unintelligible mystery, and to reduce the universe to an ultimate mystery is not to explain it. Again, some people think that the world is to be explained by what they call a first cause. But why should any cause be the first? Why should we stop anywhere in the chain of causes? Every cause is necessarily the effect of a prior cause. The child who is told that God made the world and the who inquires who, in that case, made God, is asking a highly sensible question. Or suppose, in tracing back the chain of causes, we come upon one which we have reason to say is really the first. Is anything explained thereby? Still, we are left with an ultimate mystery. Whatever the principle of explanation is, it cannot be a principle of this kind. It must be a principle which explains itself and does not lead to something further, such as another cause. In other words, it must be a principle which has its whole being in itself, which does not for its completeness refer us to anything beyond itself. It must be something fully comprehended in itself without reference to anything outside it. There is to say, it must be what we call self determined or absolute. Now, any absolute principle must necessarily be one. Suppose that it were two. Suppose you attempt to explain the world by two principles, x and y, each of which is ultimate, neither being derived from the other. Then what relation does x bear to y? We cannot fully comprehend x without knowing its relation to y. Part of the character and being of x is constituted by its relation to y. Part of x's character has to be explained by y, but that is not to be self explained. It is to be explained by something not itself. Therefore, the ultimate explanation of things must be one. The Eleatics then were perfectly correct in saying that all is one and that the ultimate principle of the universe being is one. But if we examine the way in which they carried out their monoism, we shall see that it broke down in a hopeless dualism. How did they explain the existence of the world? They propounded the principle of being as the ultimate reality. How then did they derive the actual world from the principle? The answer is that they neither derived it nor made any attempt to derive it. Instead of deducing the world from their first principle. They simply denied the reality of the world altogether. They attempted to solve the problem by denying the existence of the problem. The world, they said, is simply not being. It is an illusion. Now, certainly, it is a great thing to know which is the true world, which the false, but after all, that this is not an explanation. To call the world an illusion is not to explain it. If the world is reality, then the problem of philosophy is how does the reality arise? If the world is illusion, then the problem is how does that illusion arise? Call it illusion if you like, but this is not explaining it. It is simply calling it names. This is the defect, too, of Indian philosophy, in which the world is said to be Maya, delusion. Hence, in the Eleatic philosophy, there are two worlds brought face to face, lying side by side of each other, unreconciled. The world of being, which is the true world, and the world of facts, which is illusions. Although the Eleatics deny the sense word and call it illusion, yet of this illusion they cannot rid themselves. In some sense or other, this world is here, is present. It comes back upon our senses and demands explanation. Call it illusion, but it still stands beside the true world and demands that it be deduced from that. So that the Eleatic have two principles, the false world and the true world, simply lying side by side without any connection, link between them, without anything to show how to one arise from the other. It is utterly irreconcilable dualism. It is easy to see why the Eleatic philosophy broke down in the dualism, being, they say, has in it no becoming. All principle of motion is expressly excluded from it. Likewise, they deny to it any multiplicity. It is simply one without any many in it. If you expressly exclude multiplicity and becoming from your first principle, then you can never get multiplicity and becoming out of it. You cannot get out of it anything that is not in it. If you say absolutely there is no multiplicity in the absolute, then it is impossible to explain how multiplicity comes into the world. It is exactly the same in regard to the question of quality. Pure being is without quality, it is mere isness. It is an ultimate featureless, characterless being, perfectly empty and abstract. How then can the quality of things issue from it? How can all the riches and variety of the world comes out of emptiness? The Eleatics are like jugglers who try to make you believe that they get rabbits, guinea pigs, pieces of string, paper, and ribbon out of an entirely empty top hat. One can see how utterly barren and empty this principle is if one translates it into figurative language, that is to say, into language of religion. The Eleatic principle would correspond to a religion in which we said that God is, but beyond the fact that He is, He has absolutely no character. But surely this is a wholly barren and meager conception of the deity. In the Christian religion, we are accustomed to hear such expression as not only that God is, but that God is love, God is power, God is goodness, and God is wisdom. Now, objection may certainly be taken to these predictions and epithets on the ground that they are merely figurative and anthropomorphic. In fact, they exhibit the tendency to think non sensuous objects sensuously. These predictors are merely picked up from the infinite. Now, objection may certainly be taken to these predictions, predicates, and epithets on the ground that they are merely figurative and anthropomorphic. In fact, they exhibit the tendency to think non sensuous objects sensuously. These predicates are merely picked up from the finite world and applied haphazard to God, for whom they are entirely inadequate. But at least these expressions teach us that out of mere emptiness nothing can come, that the world cannot arise out of something which is lower and poorer than itself. Here in the world, we find in a certain measure love, wisdom, excellence, power. These things cannot spring from a source which is so poor that it contains nothing but isness. The less can arise out of the greater, but not the greater out of the less. We may contrast Eliatism not only with Christianity, but even with popular modern agnosticism. According to this, the absolute is unknowable, but what is agnostic means is that human reason is inadequate to grasp the greatness of the ultimate being. But the Eleatic principle is not that in saying God is love, power, wisdom, we are saying too little about God and that our ideas are inadequate to express the fullness of his being, but on the contrary, that they express too high an idea for God, of whom nothing can be said except he is, because there is absolutely nothing more to say. This conception of God is the conception of an absolutely empty being. Monoism, I said, is a necessary idea in philosophy. The absolute must be one, but an entirely, utterly abstract monoism is impossible. If the absolute is simply one, wholly excluded of all process and multiplicity, out of such an abstraction, the process and multiplicity of the world cannot issue. The absolute is not simply one or simply many, it must be a many in one, as correctly set forth in the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. Religion moved from an abstract polytheism, God is many, to an abstract monotheism, God is one, Judaism, Hinduism, and Islam. But it does not stop there. It shyly passes one to concrete monotheism, God is many in one, Christianity. There are two popular misconceptions regarding the doctrine of Trinity. The first mistake is that of popular rationalism. The second is that the popular theology. Popular rationalism asserts that the doctrine of the Trinity is contrary to reason. Popular theology asserts that it is a mystery which transcends reason. But the truth is that it neither contradicts nor transcends reason. On the contrary, it is itself the highest manifestation of reason. What is really a mystery? What really contradicts reason is to suppose that God, the Absolute, is simply one without any multiplicity. This contradiction results in fatal dualism, which broke out in Eliaticism and has broken out in every other system of thought, such as that of the Hindus or that of Spinoza, which begins with the conception of the absolute as a pure one, totally exclusive of the many.